Good day, my beautiful children. Today is Wednesday, May the 13th, and I have changed my mind. In my infinite wisdom, I've decided instead of jumping into China, I've already talked about communist revolutions, and they all pretty much go the same way. You got a bunch of peasants, they're being oppressed. Here comes people spreading communism, offering these people a way out, sharing the wealth, and then they go for it and they get rid of the haves and blah blah blah. We may come back to that maybe next week, but I thought that we should wrap up the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union because you guys are growing up in a period of time where the we don't worry about Russia like we used to, and there is no Soviet Union. So what the heck happened? Well, that's where we're headed next. Um, I don't know what we're going to finish with. I have India and Gandhi. I've got Africa. I've got Latin America. All these things we didn't get to because we had to slow things down since we've been on break. So if you have an opinion on this of what you'd like to talk about, let me know and I will oblige. If you don't care, I'll pick something and there's a million things we could do, or we could all just agree to keep meeting together online from now until July. Either way, whatever you guys want to do. We're not meeting together till July. Mr. Hudak's got stuff he needs to do. All right. So the collapse of the Soviet Union. What happened? Well, um, in the 80s, and I remember a lot of this stuff pretty well. I was a kid, growing up in the 80s and in elementary school. And by late 88, I was in middle school, and into the 90s, I was in high school and then later college. So I wasn't paying real close attention to a lot of this stuff, but I do remember some of it. Anyway, we're going to see something called a detente. And a detente is a relaxing of tensions. So during the 70s and into the 80s, we experienced relaxing of the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States that we call a detente. In 1979, though, things had gotten a little bit worse. In 79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which we all know Afghanistan well because the United States has been involved in Afghanistan since the 90s or the early 2000s as part of our war on terror. Well, anyway, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 79, the United States saw this as an act of Soviet aggression and them trying to expand their sphere of influence. And at this time, by this time, the Soviet Union, they controlled all of Eastern Europe. They controlled Hungary and Yugoslavia and Romania and Bulgaria and all these different places. And the United States, as part of, we were still practicing uh, containment theory. We didn't want to see communism spread any further than it already had. But we also didn't want to fight the Soviet Union. We weren't interested in going to war because at this point, by 79, both the U.S. and the Soviets, they had enough nukes to destroy the planet Earth many, many, many times over and still have some stuff left over. So we were going to use economics and politics to kind of fight this war. And so in 1980, we boycotted the Summer Olympics in Moscow. And I vaguely remember that. Now, in the 80 Winter Olympics, that of course, that's the Lake Placid Miracle on Ice Olympics. Well, that next summer, there were going to be Olympics in Moscow, and we said, we ain't going. Which, if you can imagine, as an Olympian, well, of course, Olympians are going through the same thing right now with Corona, but imagine training for 4 years and then not getting to go. And then the USSR, the Soviet Union, they did the same thing to us in '84. The '84 Summer Olympics were in LA, in California, and they boycotted us. Um, on top of that, we gave aid to the Afghani fighters. And by the way, here's a great lesson in history: be careful who you give stuff to. A lot of the weapons that we gave to the Afghanistan fighters, who ended up, many of them becoming the Taliban, were used against U.S. forces later on when we were in Afghanistan. So be careful who you're giving weapons to. So here you see, Sports Illustrated and Newsweek talking about the Olympics, and I do remember this. Mostly, I remember the '84 Olympics was amazing because Without Russia there, without the Soviet Union there, we dominated. The United States dominated, and McDonald's was doing these giveaways where every time the U.S. athlete won a gold medal, they'd give away free stuff, and it like almost bankrupted. I mean, it didn't bankrupt them, but they gave away a lot of free Big Macs during the '84 Olympics. All right, enter Mikhail Gorbachev, and many of you have heard of this guy. Yes, that is a very noticeable and very distinct birthmark on his head. That is real. That is not makeup or anything. That was on the top of his dome. So Gorbachev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Now he's still communist, but he is not a hardline communist. And at this time, our president was President Ronald Reagan, and these two guys are going to work together to thaw a lot of the tensions of the Cold War. So after Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union in the mid '80s, he encouraged a period called Glasnost, which was Russian for openness. And the idea was that instead of like doing these backdoor secret dealings or doing things that are going to make each country get angry at the other country, they were going to openly talk and dialogue about the issues, about nukes and other things. So one of the first things they did is he and Reagan signed the INF Treaty, which got rid of some of our mid-range nuclear weapons. By the way, there's all kinds of nukes. I'm sure you know this, but there's the big ones that are intercontinental ballistic missiles that you can launch from the United States that could go and make it all the way to Russia and vice versa. And you've got nukes that are intermediate range that are launched from submarines or dropped from airplanes. There's all kinds of nuclear weapons. Well, the INF Treaty got rid of some of those mid-range nukes. And then the other thing that Gorbachev did is he stopped giving military aid to a lot of the Soviet satellite countries. And once that happened, that without the backing of the Soviet Union, a lot of these countries, one by one, like dominoes, got rid of communism and returned to some form of democracy and capitalism. And they had tried to do that before. Like, for example, in Poland, in the 60s, they had tried to get rid of Soviet rule, and they rolled tanks on them. Well, now without the threat of Soviet tanks and military coming down on you, people can have protests and stage elections and get rid of communism. And so one by one, you started to see the toppling of, and we would normally have a whole unit on this, but Poland became democratic and held elections. Germany, East Germany, the Berlin Wall came down, and East Germany Germany unified and became one democratic Germany, and on down the line that happened in all those countries. Well, another thing that Gorbachev brought to the Soviet Union was something called perestroika, which means restructuring. And so he's going to basically tear down the communist structure that had been built up during the time of Lenin and Stalin. And he's going to open up the Soviet Union for business, economically, and also politically. So one of the first things they did is they changed from having a total government-dominated ownership of business and property to now allowing for some private ownership. You can buy your own home and you can own your own business. He had a new parliament elected, so they got rid of a lot of the hardline communists that were in the Soviet parliament. And in 1990, he allowed for other parties other than the Communist Party to organize inside of the Soviet Union. So he's slowly moving toward a more democratic form of government, which is going to lead eventually to the fall of the Soviet Union. And look, you can make up your own opinion about communism. I'm not here to tell you how to think or what to think. But here's what I will tell you: that communism has been tried in many places, and as of yet has yet to really work on a large scale for a long period of time. It can work in a small area for a short period of time, but all of these communist revolutions that we've learned about or talked about have eventually ended, and most of them have been replaced by some form of democratic government. The only holdouts now are Cuba and China and North Korea and Vietnam are pretty much the only communist governments left. And even China, their government's communist, but their economy is more or less capitalist. So communism has not worked very well yet. I mean, maybe it could. Maybe you love communism. I don't know. I'm just telling you, as a history teacher, the record's not great. All right, end of the Soviet Union. So one of the biggest problems that the Soviet Union faced is it was so stinking huge. It's like the Roman Empire at its height. Rome encapsulated all of Europe and northern Africa and part of Western Asia. Well, the Soviet Union was as big. And Russia itself is huge, and then you add in all the Soviet satellite nations, the countries that had gone communist, and you have Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine, and all these huge. And because it's so big, there are all kinds of different people living there. Half of Russia's in Asia and half of it's in Europe. And if there was no such thing as a quote, Russian. Russian. I mean, there was, but they could be very different. There were all kinds of different ethnic groups and religious groups and other groups living within the Soviet Union. So as Gorbachev began to loosen his grip, the Soviet Union's grip on its own people, you started to see it's like a dam break. Once one group would gain independence, then another group would pop up and they would demand independence, and it was going off like wildfire all over the Soviet Union. For example, in 1989 and 1990, there were independent movements in Georgia, not the state in the United States, but Soviet Georgia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. Those are those regions up near the Baltic. Moldavia, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan, which are down near Asia, the Asian portion of the Soviet Union. So it became really apparent that very soon there was not going to be a Soviet Union anymore, and there might not even be a Russia. So in '91, a bunch of conservatives in the government who wanted things to stay the same, they had Gorbachev arrested, and they tried to seize power in a coup. And I remember this because it was weird. It was you didn't know if there was going to be a civil war in the Soviet Union, and it was kind of scary. Whoever won would have the launch code to all the nukes, and you didn't know who was going to end up winning this thing. So a guy named Boris Yeltsin, who was a member of the government, he tried to resist this coup, and they put down the revolution. And in the end, Gorbachev ends up retiring, and this guy Yeltsin ends up becoming the new leader of the Soviet Union. And in '91, they dissolved the Soviet Union. There was no more USSR. There was Russia, was its own independent nation, and then a bunch of other parts of new free countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union and that were now independent. And Yeltsin, once he took power, he tried to introduce a free market economy similar to the United States. And But at that point, it was kind of like, all right, we've lost so much of our power and so much of our land. We don't want any other provinces or any other regions to declare independence. And so then Yeltsin had to kind of take a hard line with some of these places. And speaking of hard line, in '99, Yeltsin resigned and was replaced by a guy named Vladimir Putin, who you should know. Putin has been in charge and still remains in charge in the Soviet Union since '99. He's been elected, but he's also, once he got elected, he's changed the rules about elections so that basically he has become what some people would refer to as a dictator. And he's kind of an interesting cat. He is a former KGB agent, a former basically spy, I guess, and is a lot more conservative and hardline than Yeltsin was or that Gorbachev was. And he's still trying to bring Russia into the modern age in terms of the economy, but also trying to maintain Russia's power and influence in the world. So he's done some interesting things. There's Yeltsin on the left, and there's Putin looking very Putin-y on the right. All right. So that's it for today. That kind of wraps up the Cold War and the Soviet Union. I don't know what we're going to come back and do for our last unit. You guys, like I said, weigh in and tell me if you want to learn about China and the Chinese Revolution. That'd be fine. It's kind of where I'm leaning. We could talk about Africa and some African history and what Africa is like today in the modern world. We could talk about Latin America. We could talk about Asia. Whatever you guys want to talk about, We still didn't. You could do India and Gandhi. Let me know if you have an opinion on what you'd like to do. Otherwise, we'll probably just hit China and that'll be it. So that is it for today. Peace and love, guys, and I will see you back tomorrow.